So I, like any good colloquium speaker, I changed my title. So I'm going today with Plantation, Patienthood, Managing Death in Nicaragua's Chronic Kidney Disease Epidemic. And so it's a real pleasure to finally be in a room giving a talk again. It's been a long time. And so I'm really grateful to everybody for showing up and to everybody for tuning in. And hopefully it won't be too much of me talking. We'll have a little time for questions and answers. Before I get into the talk proper, I want to sort of set out a few terms and names that hopefully will make it easier to follow me. So this talk comes from some ongoing research I've been doing with former sugarcane plantation workers at the Ingenio Montelima, which you can sort of see on the slide here, a kind of homemade map. So all these workers are confronting an epidemic of what's called chronic kidney disease of non-traditional causes, or CKD. The CKD is a form of progressive renal failure that's killed or sickened thousands of people associated with the Nicaraguan sugarcane industry over the last 2 decades or so, since around the turn of this century. And its causes are called non-traditional by scientists, partly because it's not related to diabetes or hypertension, which are the two leading causes of chronic kidney disease worldwide. So I've done most of my ethnographic field work with a group called the Asociación Monterrey Bendición de Dios, AMBED, which is an advocacy organization that formed about 8 or 9 years ago in the community surrounding the sugarcane complex of the Monterrey Corporation. So I work closely with their leaders, and I'm going to mention a couple of them in the talk today, and I call them, in the manuscript, I call them Saúl and Don Alvaro. So Montelimar is one of just 4 sugarcane concerns in Nicaragua. There's only 4 companies that produce sugarcane and sugar products. And it was one of at least 3, that's been the recipient of a loan from the International Finance Corporation, the IFC. This is the private lending arm of the World Bank that makes investments in business around the world. So in 2015, the IFC proposed to loan several $1 million to the Montelimar Corporation to expand its operations. This is part of a sort of a worldwide expansion of crops like sugarcane, oil palm, and other things around the world that the World Bank has been backing. But that loan was actually temporarily halted when AMBED filed a grievance with the IFC's Compliance Advisor Ombudsman Office, or CAO. So if you follow sort of development investment, you might have heard of the CAO. It's an interesting entity. And in that grievance, AMBED alleged that plantation working conditions, specifically the use of pesticides, long hours of exposure to heat and smoke, and poor water quality, were likely to blame for the epidemic of kidney failure. And so when I came to Montelimar in 2017, a CAO-sponsored mediation process between AMBED, this group of ex-workers and community members, and the Montelimar Corporation, this mediation process had just begun earlier that year. And one of the first things they managed to do was to sign an agreement that achieved a really important early goal, which was that the company had agreed to provide bus transportation to workers with late-stage chronic kidney disease who needed to get to dialysis treatment. So if somebody could prove that their diagnosis of CKD-NT was related to work, which is not a foregone conclusion, and could prove that they had worked for the Montelimar Corporation for at least 2 years, then they could qualify for this subsidized transport to a hemodialysis facility. And all of those are in the city of Managua. So 3 times a week, they would board a bus emblazoned with the company's name and take about a 2-hour journey. And so the ethnographic material that I'm going to talk about today is really about those bus routes. So what I'm interested in then is kind of what this experience of being one of those patients is like and what it might tell us. So this is just to give you an idea. You can sort of see, I think, in this photo here, it's not a massive bus. It's a little microbus, like a lot of interlocal transportation is in Nicaragua. And it would take waves of patients on sort of morning and afternoon sort of turnos into Managua to receive their dialysis treatment. So folks are either on a Monday, Wednesday, Friday pattern or a Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday pattern. And during the harvest season, this bus that takes the dialysis patients from the plantation zone up to Managua frequently gets trapped between these big, slow-moving semi-trucks that are packed with freshly harvested brown sugarcane. So the routes of the harvest and the routes of treatment kind of parallel each other, at least until they reach this juncture at the Pan American Highway. And at that juncture, the cane trucks bear left, going north along the Montelimar fields, which stretch all the way up to a place called Ojo de Agua. And the microbus goes right, and it starts sort of a slow climb up the hill into the capital. So by a lot of measures, the people who made it onto that bus were the lucky ones. Nicaragua's capacity to treat the growing number of people in the country with end-stage renal disease was already inadequate when the CKD-NT epidemic was first recognized at the turn of this century. So CKD-NT, the disease that I'm interested in, emerged really in parallel to an explosion in the rate of type 2 diabetes, which can lead to end-stage renal disease as well. So the Ministry of Health's nephrologists really haven't been able to keep up with this. There's not that many nephrologists in Nicaragua. So in 2020, Nicaragua had roughly 4 per million residents, 4 nephrologists per million residents. In Latin America, just to give you some perspective, the average is 18 per million. Now, both of those numbers are really too low, but what this means is that most Nicaraguan kidney disease patients will likely never meet a kidney specialist, and many of them will probably never get a chance to extend their lives through dialysis. So because access to kidney transplant is exceedingly rare, I think in a given year, you can expect less than 20 to be performed in Nicaragua. This means that, like in other parts of Latin America, the dialysis facilities that there are operate at full capacity constantly. Now, dialysis is often portrayed when you read sort of studies of it or explanations of it as a tool for the management of kidney disease. But medical anthropologists who study it often talk about how, from the perspective of patients, dialysis is better understood as the management of death. Darkness, but that's sort of where I'm going to jump off. Now, these pictures look so good because I didn't take them. These are pictures taken by a professional photographer called Ed Kashi. And there's some interesting aspects of this that I could talk about, but I think they illustrate this point that I want to make about management and death. Because I think that term management is actually not incidental and it's not insignificant for what I want to talk about. So in Nicaragua sugarcane zone, theories about the etiology of CKD-NT really start with theories about industrial management. And 2 key elements in those theories. One, that the company made excessive, irresponsible use of toxic chemicals in the production of cane. And 2, that field supervisors put pressure on cutters, seeders, and fumigators to work really long shifts in stifling heat with insufficient access to water and shade. These 2 theories locate the root causes of this particular form of kidney disease in the industrially managed cultivation of sugarcane. So those 2 parallel journeys of the microbus packed with very sick workers and the semi-trucks packed with charred, chemical-soaked cane stalks are emblems of what I see as a certain kind of industrial managerial kind of entanglement. So by assenting to Ahmed's demand that it provide some transportation for some patients to the hemodialysis clinics, the Montelimar Corporation was acknowledging the CKD-NT epidemic in its labor force to a limited degree. But it was also turning human death into a new subject of managerial control. So these exceptional few dozen folks who get to ride that bus, I think, can help us understand something about how contemporary plantations operate, particularly in Latin America. So what I want to do in the rest of this talk is just tell some of their stories. And these are definitely not easy stories to tell, and I'm sorry that it's not easy to hear. They find people struggling not over how to live, because dialysis does not save lives, but over how to die. And plantations, one way to think about what a plantation is as a technology for modulating and managing death, so human death and non-human death. As Craig Hetherington, who does anthropological work in Paraguay around the soy industry, has argued, what's important isn't merely that production of things like soy, or cotton, or sugar involve organized death. Rather, what's important is how that production of death is organized. So the connection between sugar and kidneys is something that a lot of us probably know something about, especially if we're in Latin America. Lots of parts of the regions, the word sugar, azúcar, is a euphemism for diabetes and the kidney disease that follows. So overconsumption of cheap processed sugar is definitely a key driver in epidemics of metabolic disease. What's different about CKD-NT is that it's not a disease of sugar consumption, but of sugar production. And I think this is why labor and management matter in this story. What also matters is sugar's status as a fungible commodity, as this eminently expandable and interchangeable good. So one of the fundamental processes in the making of sugarcane as that kind of commodity was the rendering of laboring bodies also as fungible, as interchangeable, as malleable, and as individually meaningless to capital. So this idea of plant and human fungibility, as you might know where I'm going with this, kind of has its origins in the transatlantic slave trade. And as Tiffany King, among others, has argued, the fungibility of the black body, in particular, was essential to the making of the sugarcane plantation complex and other plantation complexes in the Americas. So theorists of plantation life and its aftermath as experienced by Black, Asian, and indigenous people in the Americas consistently point to what Stephen Marshall calls the subjective and intersubjective experience of fungibility. So fungibility, if you like, is sort of unfreedom in the extreme. Now, today's Nicaraguan sugar plantations certainly share some features with, say, the sugar plantations of pre-Civil War America or the Caribbean, but they actually began later, and most of them began in something more like haciendas, in which workers still weren't exactly free, but they could make claims on landowners as clients to patrons. So implications of a mutual obligation of patron to client, as a lot of Latin Americanists in the room know, were particularly common during health crises. So labor here, at least in idealized terms, was kind of socially embedded. So at Montelimar, where I did field work, the company health clinic was the place where workers went when they were injured on the job, of course, but also when they had more routine health needs. So on the hacienda, at least in that ideal type, workers' lives weren't so much fungible, but specific and valuable to individuals. But the company's eventual agreement to offer free rides to dialysis clinic for this very small group of former workers really shouldn't, I don't think, be seen as a revival of some kind of hacienda-style moral economic reciprocity. It's a little more complicated than that. That agreement really emerged from the World Bank's view of companies like Montelimar as corporate persons with a responsibility to limit their liability. And along with that comes a view of labor as fundamentally free and unfettered, right? So in the eyes of the World Bank, laborers aren't clients, they're free agents. And the responsibility of management of labor here is set by the terms of the wage relationship, really nothing more than that. So the provision of transportation to the dialysis clinic, again, only for people who could prove 2 years of consistent employment with pay stubs with this company. That's not the obligation so much of a patron to a client, but the restitution of the defendant paid to a plaintiff. So it's this sort of liberal settling of accounts that makes the production of sugarcane commensurable with the production of any other fungible good. So Montelimar workers, even people who did receive that benefit of subsidized bus travel to the dialysis clinic, they didn't fully buy into this liberal logic, even though they were participants in this mediation process. Instead, they continued to make claims on the company that exceeded the individualized relationship of free wage labor to employer. And one reason for this is quite simple. The company clinic was also the first health facility to identify the onset of CKD-NT in the labor force in the 2000s. Sugarcane clinics really were the first ones to know about this, really anywhere in the world. And people who showed early biomarkers for kidney disease at the clinic were not treated by the company as clients to be cared for. Instead, they were initially actually dismissed without any explanation, without any compensation. So this sense of abandonment by the company is what sparked CKD-NT activism in Nicaragua. And the World Bank mediation process hasn't completely assuaged that sense of abandonment. If anything, the benefit of free transportation to the dialysis clinic has highlighted how plantation capitalism, even in its 21st century form with oversight by international bodies like the World Bank, still depends upon the treatments of both humans and crops as fungible. So the stories I want to talk about in the rest of the talk are about this tension between legal liability, patron-client care, and fungibility. And so this first story in the section of the chapter begins Patience as Payload. So when we first met, Mauricio was about my age, in his late 30s. And he was actually the first ex-worker to join OMBED's general membership. So he was sort of thought of as like their patient's hero. And he was also the first one to get on the dialysis bus. And like a lot of Montelimar dialysis patients, he had a few complaints about the bus service. So when we talked, he said, there are 12 of us on our bus. They picked him up at about 8 each morning, and his village was sort of on the main road to Managua, so sort of the last stop out. And so his dialysis session began at 11. Only I go to that clinic, Mauricio explained. Juan and Hector, they go to Monte España. And Felipe, he goes to another one. So because of the patchiness of Nicaragua's dialysis resources with machines and technicians and qualified nurses sort of spread out across Managua, the groups who boarded the bus in Montelimar would be sort of dropped off across the city to get their treatments. And then they would later be picked up. And this is really where the complaint kind of because even though he would arrive in the middle of the morning, it would sometimes not be till 4 in the afternoon or later that he would be picked up. And so he said they go on errands. They give them papers, orders to go collect people, collect money, things. So they come for us at 3 or 4 when I finish my session at 12:45. And so I was hearing this version of the complaint a lot about how the bus doubled duty as this kind of errand vehicle. So you have a trip to the bank, a pickup or a drop-off, an office employee, and even as more than one patient reported, actually a collection of a load of agrochemicals hoisted onto the roof of the very same bus that would take the workers back to the plantation. So these former workers were really feeling like payload. So complaints about the bus journey back and forth from treatment, I think, help underscore how the onset of CKD&T constitutes less a break or rupture than an extension of the plantation. So the sequence of events that led Mauricio to dialysis is pretty typical of people I've met. He started working at the plantation at age 15 alongside his father as what they call the cabra, sort of unofficial kind of sidekick apprentice sorts. And then later, when he got older, joined the workforce as a paid worker. And so his commitments to his family, right, which sort of began with this apprenticeship, are kind of played out within the economy of the plantation. So Mauricio was assigned lots of different kinds of duties during the years in which he was employed, and this was pretty typical. He worked as a seeder, he worked as a cutter, to a cleaner, he worked in the mill itself, but he spent a lot of time as a fumigator, working with harsh agrochemicals and very little personal protective. So his account of finding work, traveling back and forth to the company clinic, a hospital in Managua, being laid off, and later scrounging his pension and clinic and care benefits, all these entailed him kind of working to situate himself and his body within the rhythms of the plantation's economy. And again, I think that's pretty typical. Right? So in Nicaragua, you have this situation where the state does have nominally a universal healthcare system that should provide this kind of healthcare to anyone, right? But resources are low, capacity can't handle it. And of course, the corporate capacity for sort of subsidizing that care is always going to be limited, right? So this sort of state sort of mandate to provide this kind of thing and corporate capacity to help kind of reconcile. And law, or at least international regulation of the type that the World Bank and the CAL do, is sort of supposed to stand in and help do that. But as the anthropologist Joao Biel has argued, when health becomes a kind of legal, juridical, or regulatory matter, as it did at one time, biopolitical commitments are constantly entangled with and shaped by other market economic imperatives. So Mauricio was bemoaning the boredom and indignity of having to spend extra hours in the heat waiting for the bus. But more than that, he questioned what Biel calls the frugality of the corporate restitution that the bus represented. The Montelimar Corporation, like other plantation enterprises, was oriented at once to the continued efficient extraction of capital, keeping those cane-carrying semi-trucks on schedule, and to the regulation of workers' health and eventual deaths. And harmonizing those priorities is rarely easy. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to try and squeeze in all the ethnographic examples from the chapter, but there's a section that follows on from this in which I talk about what happens when OMBED activists, the kind of the most active CKD&T folks around Montelimar, try to bring new people into the bus service. So there's not actually a cap on how many people can access it, as long as they can meet the criteria of proving that they work for the company, et cetera. But I was really interested to find out that a lot of people who are diagnosed and probably could prove that even when they reach the really very painful late stages of renal disease, when dialysis can at least add some days or months to life, the folks are sometimes hesitant to take the company's offer of free transportation. And I'm starting to think of that hesitancy less as agency or resistance, but as a recognition of the impossibility of dying free or dying well. So treatment cessation in the wider literature is often cited as a leading cause of death for people who are on dialysis. And usually when people talk about that, they're talking about elderly dialysis patients in the right? Who start to question the capacity of being on dialysis to improve the quality of their lives. They start to recognize, in other words, that dialysis can temporarily extend life, but it's not going to save it, it may not actually make it better, right? So it doesn't actually have a restorative capacity. Now, the limitations of dialysis are really obvious in places like Nicaragua, where the possibility of any other alternative, like transplant, is completely out of the question for almost everybody. And because of that, the pressure to opt in and stay in on dialysis, if you can get it, it may actually be higher in resource-poor places like Nicaragua. So most studies of people who are living on dialysis talk about how once they're enrolled, patients can start to feel the onset of a kind of social death, even before physical death arrives. So if you commit to dialysis, this sort of thrice weekly, quite grueling process, bodies get disembedded from place. They get abstracted from the social and ecological ties that are important to them. So in the broader literature, including in the anthropological literature, opting out or refusing to stay on or get on dialysis is sort of seen as an act of agency, sort of a patient freedom from the constraints of the technologies of life support, right? In the pursuit of a good death or quality of life. But I think close attention to instances of dialysis hesitancy in Limar offer a kind of a different analytic. To become a patient wasn't really to be disembedded at all. Actually to join the dialysis treatment was actually to be pulled back into the plantation zone, to be reminded that one's body was in some ways always already kind of embedded in it. So again, hesitancy isn't so much resistance to agency as it is a recognition of the impossibility of dying well in that sense, or at least dying well by the terms of the liberal regime of free labor that animates liberal ethics view that this is a good thing. But I'm going to move on to the third section of the chapter, which I call the occasional patient. How often are you drinking these days? Don Alvaro asked Jairo. The question was less clinical or judgmental than gently ribbing. We hadn't come to Loma Alegre, which is a settlement on the outer edge of the plantation, looking for Jairo in particular. It just turned out that Jairo, who was drunk, had been hard to miss. Solo en ocasiones, Jairo replied. He was sort of feigning offense that Don Alvaro was a habitual drunkard. So he was kind of making a joke, and it worked. So if you translate it into English, the phrase, as many of you know, solo en ocasiones, can mean either only occasionally, as in a vague kind of now and then, or a more precise kind of on certain occasions. So Saul, the other guy I was with, sort of picked up on this. He said, ocasiones, birthdays, holidays, Tuesdays, Don Alvaro chimed in, sort of completing this sort of round of joking and greeting. And so we all laughed, but beneath that laughter, on our part at least, was a concern about the relationship between Jairo's potential reliability as a drinker and his dedication to his dialysis treatment. He was another one of the bus riders. Look, Jairo, Saul began. We were supposed to be on the bus this morning. The bus had come and gone hours ago, and this meant that Jairo risked being beset with more than a hangover when he opted to spend a Thursday night and part of a Friday morning imbibing. If you don't show up for treatment, how can we help you? Jairo wasn't apologetic, but he wasn't exactly combative either. And I don't think this was because he was numb to the problem that Saul and Don Alvaro were laying before him. The truth was that most of the time he was a pretty faithful client of the dialysis folks. His explanation for his occasional bender and subsequent choice to miss the bus sounded pretty well reasoned. He said that sometime in the previous couple of weeks, he had managed to find part-time, informal, off-the-books work back on the plantation, as it happened, helping apply herbicides in sections of the plantation near his house. So if this sort of petty violation of labor standards merited shock and outrage, Don Alvaro and Saul didn't let on. They listened calmly as Jairo explained that the work he was asked and paid to do was much the same as the work he had done before he was diagnosed with CKD. To be sure, what he got in compensation was less than what he had earned before, but Jairo confessed he enjoyed this work. But you have to be careful, Jairo, Don Alvaro admonished. The strain of being out, even for a few more morning hours in the heat and the sun, would accelerate the decline of his kidney function. So here he was echoing the advice that doctors gave to patients, always gave to people diagnosed with CKD-NT. Avoid exertion, stay sedate, watch your diet by avoiding alcohol, sugar, and greasy foods. Not even really thinking about what toxicants might be in that sprayer. Too much physical activity would lead to a faster progression of the disease. This is the logic. You get nauseated, then you get fatigued. Fatigue would lead to swelling and pain, and all this would stress your compromised kidneys. So the assumption built into these recommendations was that if you stayed home in between dialysis sessions, there would be family members and neighbors to provide care to make up for the loss in earnings that were occasioned by the diagnosis. But Jairo clarified that it wasn't as if he was out there every day like before when he was a formally employed worker. He wasn't signing on for a seasonal contract or any contract. The work was, to use the term with which he jokingly described his drinking pattern, occasional. And it was welcome. Jairo couldn't just turn over the breadwinning duties to his mother or his wife. His wife actually also worked on the plantation already. And if he wanted to contribute to the care of his family, picking up the sprayer again and doing a little fumigation was actually to him easier than looking for work in the other place where he would likely find it, which is the seaside kind of vacation town of Pochonil, which is about 45 minutes from where we were. So you might object that Jairo wasn't really thinking of his wife or his mother or his children. In spending his underground wage on alcohol, surely he was thinking of himself. Despite the advanced stage of his disease, Jairo was one of the lucky few who actually got dialysis. He was one of the minority of plantation patients who was able to get this service. So Saul and Don Alvaro kept reminding him of this, and they kept reminding him that by skipping treatments, he might be hastening his own death. But how long it would be until he died wasn't really clear. And this is something that I found really interesting in talking to people, kind of looking at the popular epidemiology of CKD-NT. Now, people tend to get diagnosed with this disease at a remarkably young age compared to other people with chronic kidney disease, usually as young as their 20s or 30s, and mostly men get diagnosed with this, and that the answer to why is still not clear. And sometimes the progression can be quite quick, but other times patients have lived for years, even before they reach the final stages with hemodialysis, and some continue to live with hemodialysis. So while Jairo's choice to seek informal plantation work meant that he missed more than a few dialysis sessions, he probably observed what a lot of people in Nicaragua had, that the disease, to an extent, could be managed in multiple ways. Now, the medical literature on patients who opt out of dialysis or opt never to seek it at all tends, again, to focus on the pros and cons of providing treatment to mostly elderly people or patients for whom renal disease is a sequel of diabetes. And the focus is whether continuing or starting hemodialysis promotes or detracts from quality of life, as I've already said. The CKD-NT patients on sugarcane plantations are a very distinct population. None of them are elderly by the terms of nephrology journals, and many of them enjoyed very good health relative to the rest of the population before they were diagnosed with kidney disease. So these are guys who are in pretty good physical shape, considering the job that they did. They had steady incomes. They had no diabetes and no heart conditions, and they certainly were obese. So CKD-NT patients, at least by the second decade of the epidemic when my research began, had time to bear witness to the temporal unpredictability of this particular disease. So places where dialysis isn't universally available and where transplant is virtually unthinkable make interesting natural experiments on survival possibilities. So for every story about a person who didn't last 6 weeks after starting hemodialysis, you could hear stories of people like Jairo, whose choice to take the bus only occasionally would have made them statistical anomalies in any research on survival rates that bifurcated patients into people on dialysis and people off dialysis. So he's sort of manipulating this stuff. To be an occasional patient like Jairo was another way of confronting how the management of disease might be blended with the management of the plantation. In order to be legible to the Monthly Mark Corporation's corporate social responsibility mechanism, people like Jairo were asked to treat their conditions as a fundamental break with the past. They were asked to deny what was so apparent to them, right? That they were still parts of the plantation, right? That they were still embedded there. So to me, it's not too much to think of Jairo's return to plantation work on this occasional, informal basis as part of a kind of creative reckoning with his own experience of fungibility. By working in the margins of the labor force, he wasn't only avoiding the isolation and extraction from home and environment that ethnographers of dialysis often talk about. He was thinking to himself, why limit the benefits that he and his family could extract from one's Limar corporation to a bus ride? Why not milk the company for a few more quadrants by fumigating the needs of the cane? Essentially, he knew he was going to die. He was dwelling in what Zoe Wool and Julie Livingston called the uncertain temporalities and patterns created by the liberal yearning toward the good life. Occasional patients like Cairo countered the frugality of legal and corporate grievance mechanisms with a more capacious and less deterministic approach to the progression of death. This is the last section, which I'll call corporate. So over the course of about 2017 and 2018, OMBED actually formalized the complaint, like I mentioned, that Mauricio leveled about the bus doing double duty as a patient carrier and as an errand vehicle for Plantation. And they actually filed a subsequent kind of sub-grievance and submitted it to the corporation and the cow. And eventually they actually made the bus schedule much more reliable through this. So by 2019, fewer patients are being forced to wait as the bus picked up supplies or office workers or other non-medical things from around Managua. By that time, the Montelimar Corporation had also identified a point person for the bus service, this sort of young HR specialist. His name was Emilio. So Emilio turned out to be a popular guy among the dialysis patients. And it started to seem like the bus problem was being managed, there's no other word for it, rather smoothly. So harmonizing patient demands with managerial priorities started to seem like it was going okay, but it remained challenging. So hemodialysis is really grueling. A session can leave a person exhausted, disoriented, nauseated, and Nicaragua's dialysis clinics by and large lack the support staff to provide food or physical comfort. So in response, Montelimar patients had started bringing companions with them. And they didn't ask permission from the company to do this, but it appeared not to bother Emilio, who was sort of a natural when it came to corporate social responsibility and human relations. He was really good at answering phone calls promptly, even after hours. He remembered people's names, and he appeared to know when to kind of bend the rules to kind of tamp down conflict between the ex-workers and the company. But then, at the end of 2019, towards the end of the summer, Emilio left the company, took a new job off the plantation. The talented guy without better work. So a few weeks later, on a Saturday morning, a new HR official boarded the bus when it stopped in front of the mill. And he stepped on to inform the riders that starting that next Monday, only patients would be permitted on board. From then on, companions are going to be banned. So I heard about this new ruling one day around the same time. I was in a place called Villa El Carmen with Don Alvaro, and we were recording a conversation with two women, Ana and her sister Julia. And their father had been one of the CKD bus riders. And so as we gathered there on Anna's porch, our conversation kind of turned to this practice of companionship on the bus. So this epidemic, as I mentioned a minute ago, overwhelmingly affects men, but women overwhelmingly serve as the bus riding caregivers, and in a way as advocates for those patients. So Ana and Julio told me that when their father began dialysis, there actually wasn't a bus service yet. He is one of those people who had been kind of a long hauler on this. But at that time, patients were on their own. So before there was a free bus, if a family could get access to dialysis, they had to spend their own money to get from the Plantation area up to Nicaragua. So they said they were spending about 7,000 cordobas per month, which at that time was more than $200 for transport back and forth to the clinic. But they said they had no choice, and Ana explained it this way. She said, I had to be there to ask, Papa, do you need some water? Here, have this juice, have a little bread, you know. There are times when they finish the treatment and they don't want to eat. So in my bag, I bring a little bread. Sometimes he says, no, I don't want to eat, and a little while later I say, now are you going to eat? And I have to watch to make sure they don't leave nauseated with pain. If he does, I go back. I look for the doctor. One has to be there for one's relatives so they don't feel alone. And this, I thought, was really interesting. She said, emotionally, we're not all the same. Some of us get depressed more easily than others. So we have to travel with our patients. And in the hospital, they encourage it, Julia added. They don't want to see the patients come to the clinics alone. But when every patient brought a companion with them, conditions on the bus became crowded. Earlier that week, Gregoria, the head of HR, sort of the boss of all of the HR department, also boarded the bus. And she actually took a camera phone with her and took pictures of the crowd, sort of like this one, as it was massing onto the bus. And she later showed it to me and others, noting how some patients, and not just companions, were standing in the aisles, gripping those or overhead storage bins for balance. And if you've ever ridden a microbus or a big bus in Nicaragua, you probably know that that's kind of a particular physical skill, right? But it's much more difficult when you're weakened by end-stage renal disease. And then on the way back, after dialysis, it was even harder. So Gregoria's version of the company's justification for banning companions was that the patients had to be protected from injury. It was for their own good. An overcrowded bus was a liability for the corporation and for the patients alike. Don Alvaro, the AMBED leader, had heard Gregoria's side of things, but he thought something else was going on. He said that he had heard that the new manager, the one who had replaced Emilio, the guy everybody liked, had told everyone that the owners, the administration of the mill, the managers, had been unaware of what was going on in the bus, the addition of these companions, and that this new manager was told that he couldn't have that because the upper management had authorized the bus only for the use of dialysis. And they thought basically that people were literally taking a free ride, that they were taking advantage of this. So unlike his predecessor, Emilio, this new guy was unwilling to look the other way. So according to a strict reading of the actual agreement that AMBED had signed with the Montelimar corporations, the fact was that the company was right. Companions were not authorized, but the riders had brought them along anyway. And management had come to see this as excessive. Too many people on the bus was a safety issue, but it was also clearly an issue of economy, right? More people on board meant more fuel, more time on the road, more payload. So if the bus wasn't allowed to pick up supplies and ferry office staff from the city to the mill, why should relatively healthy companions get this free transportation up to the city? So by the time of this conversation that we had at Julio and Anna's house, the outright ban on companions had been delayed, pending AMBED's formal investigation and grievance, asking to amend the original agreement and establish these companions as legitimate riders. And they said that they would do this even if it meant finding a larger bus, maybe like one of the big yellow Bluebird buses that we used, maybe with work teams from field to field. So they knew they had the room to just refuse it. So AMBED's appeal would hinge not just on the letter of the original statement they had signed, but on a dual commitment of plantation management to former workers and family members to one another. So in other words, they were positing a kind of corporate responsibility that went beyond the free wage relationship and beyond the construction of CKD and T patients primarily as laborers, right? To think of them as something more than just the sum of their labor. So their hope was an appeal to a kind of shared sense of social nicety. And the conversations we started having about this, including with Ana and Julio, revolved around how the companions could become better at what they did on the bus, better at the etiquette of bus riding, right? So they actually agreed that able-bodied companions should give up their seats to the weaker patients. But they also thought that the new bus manager should learn to treat riders with respect, as Emilio did them. So they were sort of trading on the sort of varying qualities of HR officials that they encountered. And at one point in our conversation at their house, Julio and Ana started talking about how they could use their mobile phones to make clandestine recordings of the new HR manager, Emilio's replacement, to sort of document how rude he was to the riders and the companions, right, and how dismissive he had been, right, for taking up space, for wasting company time and resources. And they thought they could use these recordings to embarrass management into making the companions a permanent part of the passenger payload. At the same time, they were sort of strategizing about how they could get the patients to do more to regulate themselves. And in AMBED's proposal, they actually decided they were going to appoint the leader for each sort of dialysis group, right? Each kind of each wave of people on each bus trip. A person that would sort of ensure that the patients were prioritized for seating and that everybody kind of paid themselves. So the bottom line for them was that companionship wasn't excessive, right? But notice that this wasn't a declaration of freedom, but a declaration of interdependence, right? This weird combination of familial and sort of corporate and community interdependence. In other words, I think they were kind of manipulating the concept of corporate social responsibility to expand it beyond what the company had actually imagined. So it was this method of managing debt that exceeded the logic of corporate limited liability. And as Don Alvaro put it, there was a reason for this. He said, I think that as a family member, one should feel glad to know that they fought to support a relative up to the end, the last moment, because after that, what? You're bringing flowers to a grave. But there are people who want to do this but can't because of their resources, their limitations. So how do you help people help others die? Well, that's my words. Don Alvaro was speaking of the duty to care that can't seems to be reduced to proximities between the perpetrator and victim or patient of the client. Zoe Wool and Julie Livingston, who I mentioned a minute ago, right? Attention to these kinds of modes of being to others analytically sharpens our sense of the fragility of forms of relationality that we might usually count on for systematic social life. And what I think they mean by that is that people think about the categories in which they find themselves. So one thing that seemed certain was that the company wasn't going to purchase flowers, and they weren't going to purchase coffins. And maybe this was why people in the plantation zone were already so adept, even before this bus companion issue came up, at recording their funerals and recording their burials on their camera phones and circulating them on social media. So Don Alvaro, when he talked about how people needed to be there right up to the end, drew this line connecting companionship during dialysis and graveside visitation, not only because these were typologically similar obligations, but also because even though it wasn't spoken out loud, everyone knew that inviting a patient to take a drink of juice, slipping a little salt under their tongue when their blood pressure dropped, or giving them a seat on the bus as it wound down the mountain was life support, or more accurately, a kind of extended palliative care, the part of grief that begins really before death itself. So a couple of quick concluding thoughts. So plantations have been depicted in both corporate strategies and in sort of critical theory and anthropology as kind of prototypes for the totalizing hermetic industrial factory. Stories abound of the extermination of unmarketable plants, the destruction of unpliable communities, and the callousness in the face of the humans and other beings that suffer as a result. But this isn't, of course, the story. Plantations, looked at closely, can actually be quite fragile as subjects. And the boundaries between corporation and community, family and individual, field and clinic are under constant negotiation. The spatial and temporal demands of intimacy and care are woven into those of capital accumulation, not only because vulnerable communities depend on capital, but also because plantation capital relies for its sense of its own value on what Sarah Besky calls a reproductive outside, a space where the material and moral excesses of the extractive regime can be absorbed. And this absorption is not simple, and I don't think it's redemptive either. So people who were able to be counted as CKD and T patients had to appear on the monthly Mar Corporation's employment rolls. And by taking the opportunity to become passengers on that dialysis bus, they re-entered the corporate accounts as different kinds of expenditures, offset, one presumes, by the public relations and economic benefits that accrue to a company that can demonstrate a commitment to social responsibility. So what I think this material may help us understand is the slipperiness of the categories and terminologies we've come to use to think about people and their bodies: labor, patient, caregiver, etc. In many ways, the precise operations of corporate sugarcane production become clearest not when we forensically investigate how production does immediate harm in the form of toxic poisoning or environmental damage or workplace injury, but when we look at corporate efforts to limit that harm. So plantation violence emerges in the careful management of slow death as much as in the wanton perpetration of acute damage. So the management of death entails a toggling between fungibility, patron-client care, and liberal legal liability limitation. Actually, the very idea of socially responsible corporation arguably has its roots in the myth of the plantation as a moral economic system, like the hacienda, where mutual obligations mattered and where bodies were specific and historical and individual rather than interchangeable and fungible. That myth depends on a view of labor as a pathway to full humanity, one of the founding fictions of the transatlantic slave trade. And that myth is what makes it seem natural that access to dialysis should be connected to a documented history of work. The stories I've been trying to tell about people's ambivalence towards the dialysis bus, I think, can help us understand how that myth works in tension with another myth, and that's the myth of the fungible body, the totally interchangeable, totally expendable labor. Contemporary corporate social responsibility schemes, including those promoted heavily by the World Bank and the International Finance Corporation, constantly confront the problem that capital accumulation in agribusiness depends on the disappearance of labor into accounts, along with pesticides, seeds, water, and energy. And as sugarcane production becomes more mechanized and more dependent on chemicals, labor is actually drying up. Thanks to these technologies, there are actually fewer jobs than ever on Nicaraguan sugarcane plantations. So this means that the very possibility of a labor-based form of advocacy or solidarity may be decaying along with the bodies of people seeking. Thanks.